My name is Colleen Woods. I'm an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland in College Park. I consider myself a historian of U.S. imperialism, particularly focusing on the Philippines and Asia Pacific. I published a book in 2020 called Freedom Incorporated, Anti-Communism and Philippine Independence in the Age of Decolonization. And I'm just starting work on a sort of second project that looks at the U.S. military's reliance on low-wage Filipino laborers. So I'm going to talk about a few sort of key concepts for, primarily my first book, but kind of my larger intellectual trajectory, I think. And the first one I want to talk about is decolonization. And here I mean the sort of historical period, right? Less of the sort of let's decolonize museums, right? I think these are related, but really I'm talking about a sort of historical moment in time and a process, because this is really where the book project started, which, like many first books for historians, grew out of my dissertation. And so it really all began with me taking courses on comparative colonialisms, empire, at the University of Michigan, where I was a grad student. And I was just reading a ton of, not just about the U.S. empire, but about French and British and Japanese empires. And I just really noticed that in the many books and edited collections on decolonization, the Philippines just was barely there. Maybe, in just like a couple of sentences, there would be a line that would be something along the lines of, and the U.S. set the Philippines free in 1946, right? So number one, I sort of objected to this kind of language of the U.S. setting the Philippines free. But the more I thought about it, the more I sort of wondered, essentially, kind of, where was the Philippines in this story? And in part, I was really trained as a U.S. and the world scholar, so I was really interested in sort of the U.S. interventions in decolonization. That was my sort of time period for trying to understand U.S. imperialism. And I sort of came to realize that it wasn't just a kind of a historiographical problem, right? In other words, it wasn't just about the ways that historians write about history, right? I think for me, I understood it was something not just a problem of omission on the part of historians, right? But that there was actually kind of a historical question that I wanted to dig at, which was, I think kind of simple, which is you kind of like, what did the Philippines and in U.S. colonial history mean for U.S. policymakers and Philippine elites in this period of like kind of real fracturing and kind of collapsing of the global imperial racial order, particularly in Asia. And so when I looked closer, sort of digging into the archival work, one thing that became kind of immediately clear is that despite what policymakers were saying, which was, essentially kind of like the U.S. policymakers essentially saying like, the colonial period was more or less a success in the Philippines, and the Philippines could stand, quite literally as a model colony, right? On Independence Day in 1946, Truman doesn't attend, but sends a message that essentially says something along the lines of, the Philippines has set a model for the rest of the world to follow, right? Because the U.S. is, by this point, looking towards decolonization, right? Not in any rapid way, right? It's going to be very controlled from the U.S. point of view, but right, they are looking towards the sort of dwindling of imperial control, or colonial control, I should say. But when you look at, people know this, right? About if you study the Philippines, the period after World War II is a period of like intense violence, right? In fact, like the sort of violence of World War II doesn't really end in the Philippines. And so what was kind of confusing to me is like, there is actually this decolonization struggle in the Philippines. And it looks like other decolonization struggles happening in Southeast Asia, in Malaysia, and French Indochina or Vietnam. But yet we, as historians and historical actors at the time, really don't include that as in our sort of grand histories of decolonization. And so really the first half of the book is, an attempt to, I would ultimately say the book is, trying to make a case for the significance of the Philippines in terms of decolonization, right? And that the Philippines is really a linchpin for the United States in constructing what I call its sort of decolonized empire. And so the first half of the book is really kind of looks at anti-colonial or anti-imperial struggles starting in the primarily the 30s, a little bit in the 20s as well, and through the war years, and really U.S. efforts to kind of control the meaning over what Philippine independence, not just control the meaning, but, control the meaning, what Philippine independence would mean for the United States and for the Philippines, but really projecting the Philippines on a global stage. But what would the Philippine independence kind of look like? Like what would the, kind of structure of the Philippines look like? And then the second half of the book, and this is really after the sort of period of state violence has calmed down. It never really disappears, but it's not as sort of raging as it is in the immediate post-war period. So the second half of the book really turns to this moment when the U.S. kind of and Philippine elites really project the Philippines as a kind of model of both colonial development, but decolonization. Like it's sort of, this is how to successfully decolonize, right? And so this is when Filipinos start to travel to other sites, particularly in Southeast Asia, to essentially kind of train sort of anti-communist allies and anti-communist warfare, right? And these is based on sort of models that were developed in the war against the hooks during the post-war years. So that's really my first term, right? Is sort of thinking about, how do we understand the Philippine independence and this moment of decolonization? What is its significance? And my book essentially claims that it's hugely significant, and it's not something that we can overlook, in that overlooking it has been, a product of both the ways in which U.S. historians, but also historians of other empires have thought about the U.S. empire, but a product of the historical actors of the time, right? A real effort to sort of distance the United States from the rest of the imperial order. Term two is, I think, a term that, anybody working on empire, really anybody working on U.S. history for that matter, are quite familiar with, right? And this is the idea of American exceptionalism. There's tons of variants of exceptionalism. I think the most common one is the idea of national exceptionalism, right? The notion that the United States is essentially kind of like a nation like any other. And, the roots of that kind of national exceptionalism really kind of lay in a transatlantic conversation, right? Europeans writing about the United States, and the United States writing about, why is the United States different from European nations? And, I should mention that Ian Terrell has written sort of a whole book on the topic very recently about the varieties of American exceptionalism. So for me, I think that kind of exceptionalism is important, understanding national exceptionalism, but I was seeing something that I wanted to be really specific about. And so I call it imperial exceptionalism, right? And this is essentially, really drilling down on the ways in which American actors and also Philippine elites at times, right, produced ideas about how the United States was an empire unlike any other, right? And in fact, a sort of anti-imperial empire. I think it was the most kind of potent form of that ideology. It's sort of to kind of understand this, like, I think the starting point has to be the recognition that all empires are different, right? And I actually don't think we're all the way there yet as historians. Even as historians of U.S. empire, I still feel like we were kind of caught in some loop conversations about like, what kind of empire the United States is, right? But for me, the starting point, and this really comes from my background of studying, having a field in comparative empires, is that like all empires are different, right? They are a single empire. The British Empire, for example, looks different across time and space, right? Two imperial sites in 1930, British Empire looked quite different, right? And there's actually really good works about this. And so I wanted to sort of really get past the sort of being hung up on the sort of typology question, right? That is the United States different? Is it exceptional, right? And really deal with it as a historical problem, right? I think too often we deal with it as a historiographical problem, right? Really focusing on the ways that historians have written about history. And this is why it's a really important keyword for me, is I want to think about it. I think about it as a product of history, right? And in a really, really potent form of imperial power, right? Is the production of these ideologies about, what makes the United States different, usually better, right? Unique, stands out of time and space in some ways, right? Doesn't follow a historical pattern of the rise and fall of other empires, right? And so the point for me was like, not really to draw out the sort of the historical differences between the United States and other imperial powers in Southeast Asia, right? As I said, they're all different. I think that needs to be our starting point. But rather to sort of kind of make clear and analyze how claims about U.S. imperial exceptionalism changed as the Philippines transitioned from a colony to an independent republic, and really as anti-colonial movements gained steam through World War II and the early Cold War period, right? So like if I have any sort of like flag that I will always be waving as a historian, it will be that we need to think of the U.S. as operating on a kind of global terrain of empires, particularly in this moment in time, and that all of these empires have exceptionalist claims, right? And that these exceptionalist claims are about claims to power, right? They're ways of substantiating power. Was the idea of the global, right? And this really comes from the sort of Cold War studies part of the manuscript. And, there's this sense to, I think a lot of people are familiar with the idea of a global Cold War, right? Really, Adar and Westad's book, The Global Cold War, made a huge splash. And, he's not talking about necessarily the kind of the world split into and I think sort of older variations, right? He's way more attentive to sort of things happening on the ground. But at the same time, my reading of literature, it just always seemed to me that like we were treating the Cold War as if like it was a force of nature, right? That it was something that kind of like swept over the world, as if like without human agency, right? And so that always felt weird to me, right? Because, when we think about wars, we often think about, the choices humans make that either, lead to war, avoid war, what kinds of choices do they make during the war? But somehow this like, the idea of the Cold War it was just, again, like this kind of force of nature that we just kind of accept, right? That after World War II, there's this thing called the Cold War. And, when I started the project, I really thought, this is like way back, right? Very beginning of dissertation, I really thought the project was going to be about, kind of how the U.S. brought the Cold War to the Philippines as a kind of strategy for maintaining sort of like a kind of imperial intervention. But when I went to the Philippines and did research, I really sort of flipped that on end, right? That Americans weren't simply like carrying the Cold War with them to the Philippines, right? That, the anti-communism, there's a deep history of anti-communism in the Philippines, and Filipino elites were sort of very invested in making the claim that the Philippines was a quote unquote global front in the Cold War. So for me to sort of, I wanted to kind of take apart the Cold War in some ways. So for me, I came to think about like space making, essentially, right? How are historical actors, and not just their ideology, not just like their speech and what they're saying, right? But really their actions, right, are determining essentially kind of scales of conflict, right? So to put it like in just a concrete example, how does what is really just kind of a rebellion, how does the Hook Rebellion become part of the Cold War, right? And I think so, for certainly a generation of scholarship, and I don't think this scholarship has disappeared, to be honest with you, right? The assumption is, well, like they're communists, so of course it's part of the Cold War, right? And to me, that makes no sense. It just like, it doesn't, it sort of, again, kind of naturalizes this idea that the Cold War is something that kind of moved on its own, right? When we know from careful historical studies that like communism looked really different all over the place, right? And so, I really wanted to kind of think about like the political project of setting the sort of geographic boundaries of anti-communist warfare, right? So what made the Hook Rebellion become a sort of global front in the war against communism, right? And what I, argue is that there's a real, anti-communists are really invested in constructing what they call a global war, right? They're really invested in waging a war without territorial borders, right? And that's ultimately what a global war is, right? The global is kind of like the scale, the geographic scale of last resort, right? Above the local, the national, regional, right? And thinking about, what in sort of that kind of space making on geographic scales, what does that make possible, right? And if my book were like 2 books, it would be to sort of follow the sort of global connection, the connections that I believe start in the Philippines and sort of end up going elsewhere and made possible because of this kind of global framing, right? There's a whole like Latin America's part of this project that doesn't even make it into the book, right? Chronologically, it sort of fell out, but like there's Filipinos in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that are like, we are the greatest people to wage anti-communist warfare in Latin America. And I really it would have been archivally very difficult, I think, but really would have loved to sort of follow those linkages. I really kind of stuck in Southeast Asia. So yeah, I mean, that would be my last keyword, right? Is to think about the sort of politics of geographic scales and how actors can put them to use. And to be fair, like the left, I would say, I really don't like to use like communist because it is actually like quite a diverse group of actors on the Philippine left at this time, right? Anti-communist, I'm comfortable with that, right? But the sort of Philippine left also has a global vision, right? I would never not say that they don't also have ways in which they are projecting their politics or political struggle onto a global stage as well, right? They're drawing connections between decolonization and other parts of the world, right? So they are also participating in this kind of globalization of conflicts. It's right. It's not simply the anti-communists that are doing it. It's really striking how much U.S. policymakers just cannot believe that peasants can come to their own political ideas about their situation, right? They really, it's like almost an unthinkable to them, right? So they really believe that like there has to be some, essentially kind of bad doers who are like selling these people a bad idea about making promises about what communism or Marxism might offer them, right? They really cannot imagine that like a people of a lower class, right, can come up with their own political ideas based on their life experiences and knowing what they know about the world around them, right? And to me, that is also that is a deeply, again, I think there's a race part of it too, right? Certainly if this is Americans, right? But that's ultimately about class, I think, right? And the failure to see working class people as political actors, to be honest with you, right? And so that's the other class part of it, I think. And that's, one of the things that actually makes, these American counterinsurgent specialists, they call themselves specialists, believe that they can take a model that they developed in the Philippines and like drop it in Vietnam and it will work just as well, right? Because they believe that there's like a kind of empty peasant, right? Who, some Marxist comes along and dumps ideas into their head, makes all these promises, and right, and what needs to happen is like this sort of good rational Americans need to come and basically show them that, they've been sold a kind of bill of lies, right? And that continues to fail. I mean, I think it's obvious why it fails, right? Because it doesn't take seriously the fact that that people, right, whatever their class, are able to sort of analyze their circumstances, right, and come up with solutions, right, or ideas about what might work best for them, right? Even if they're exposed to like Marxist ideas, right? They have to think about how do they fit into their lives, right? But Americans really can't imagine that, right? And so they think they can make sort of modular a kind of peasant warfare, right? Because I think are deeply classist, right? And can't imagine that, working class or peasant people, can have these kind of analyses. I mean, it's really striking to see it like in the archives again and again, right? Right, like you kind of read theories of it, and then you're like, oh shit, I am actually seeing this in the archives, right? And like I think of myself as a careful historian, right? And so one of the things like I always wanted to do about this book is like overwhelmed with evidence in some ways, right? Because I knew that there would be people out there, right? And, people certainly within the field of diplomatic history that would be like, yeah, but were they really communist? How communist were they, right? And for me, like, I hate that question. Like, it's kind of beside the point, right? But I wanted to sort of really document, as much as I could, the sort of political program that I could, grasp through archival sources, but then also the response to it, right? And to really like make concrete this kind of politics as much as possible. I think the Cold War, and definitely the global Cold War, right, is class warfare. For me, to understand the kind of deep anti-communist violence is really about understanding efforts to maintain more or less the kind of class structure of the imperial world, right? And, so in the Philippines, this meant, right, the people that were the Filipinos that were running the colonial state, right? And by, the 30s, they are running the colonial state, right? The US still has sovereignty and is still able to make all kinds of interventions and, put their foot down in various ways, right? But, Filipino elites or colonial elites are running the state. They want to stay in power, right? And that they are challenged by essentially it's not just, a kind of peasant class, although peasants make a big part of it. Unionist, right? Some left-leaning sort of civil society folks, intellectuals, right? Who really start organizing in the 20s and 30s. And really, many of them see themselves as part of this kind of Leninist-inspired interwar anti-colonial challenge, right? And even, Alan, this, right? Some travel to the Soviet Union, they travel to China, right? And meet with, fellow sort of Marxist or Leninist-inspired anti-colonials. And actually, I think that for me, when I was like doing historical research, I think like that was like one of the biggest kind of threats to the United States, right? The United States was very invested in like containing making sure that the Philippines is not part of the imperial order, which would mean that the United States is essentially like on the wrong side of the global racial order, right? That is their mission in decolonization, right? How could they be the kind of like, the good anti-imperial Western power? That process starts, right, in the colonial period when Americans are really invested in kind of driving this wedge between sort of Leninist ideas about, again, the colonial racial order and U.S. colonization in the Philippines, like the sort of reality that the U.S. is part of that global project. My argument is that the sort of Philippine left is really more of kind of like a New Deal left in some ways, right? There are absolutely communists, there are absolutely socialist, but the things that the sort of the hooks and their allies are asking for, like access to credit, they're asking to participate in the electoral, they do participate in the electoral system, right? You do get, sort of this moment where there's a sort of hardening of the Communist Party line in the Philippines. But right in this period of 45 to 49, right, it's really, I wouldn't call it liberal, right? But I would certainly put it in a, I would certainly say that it's how do I want to sort of qualify it? I would say it's not based on the Soviet model in some ways, right? But what they're asking for does challenge, right, what the colonial elite is used to having, which, right, is kind of ultimate power in the Philippines, control over the economy, control over the politics. And that's the thing that's sort of intolerable to them. I think curiously, what was sort of interesting, there's like lots of US policymakers who are pretty critical of that position of the Philippine elite, right? But ultimately, the US is way more invested in maintaining a colonial order across, across the independence than they are in siding with values that wouldn't really have been out of step in kind of New Deal America, to be honest with you. And so this is, that's really why I see like there's an intense class dynamic at play in the Cold War. And again, I would call it a class war, right? And anti-communists are reactionaries, essentially. Wow. The first person, like I always say this first, is my Filipino Tagalog teacher at Michigan, Joy Barrios. I started taking Filipino, like, I guess the summer after my first year at Michigan. And she was an anti-Marcos activist. She's a poet. She's an all-around amazing person. And she was just like a champion for me as I sort of struggled through learning a language that was like really, really different than one I'd ever studied before. And she, connected me with people at UP during my first trip there, right? She connected me with the faculty union there. And so I just feel, really indebted to her, both for, seeing my potential as a scholar, but also introducing me to the sort of political community of leftists in the Philippines that, had, nurtured her as well. Of course, my CIASI 2010, Alan, is that a super important crew to me as well, right? I think language study, if people can do it, is really, really important. I would not ever call myself fluent. Terrible speaker, really shy, nervous speaker. But just the experience of learning language, I think, was just really important to me. I think anybody who writes about like the Hook Rebellion, like Ben Kerkvliet, like, that book is, I don't know how many years old now, but to me is still, I think, the best book about the conflict. His archival research really just kind of offered a roadmap. Unfortunately, like the book came out before the archives had moved to College Park. And so like the locations were really different. So, it took some work to sort of figure out, to follow his kind of breadcrumbs. and we've exchanged a couple of emails, and I would say that he's also to me, has always been a really, kind of nice person. Vina Lanzona, right? My book would not be my book without her work, because her work on the women of the Hook Rebellion, because, she just, through oral histories, captured voices, on the ground voices that I was just never going to be able to get archivally, right? Maybe if I had unlimited time and unlimited resources and I could go to sort of small barrio libraries or something, right, that I could really travel the Philippines and really kind of dig as much as I could. I could have done that, but like, she did that work. And, one of the things that to me was really important about that book is, her interviewees just, basically kind of saying what I thought was happening, which is, why they were participating in the rebellion, and then why many of them, it can kind of stopped fighting as well. And so those two books, right, I think those are, we're just hugely, those books were always next to me, I would say, when I was sort of writing. Al McCoy, right? I think for like the type of scholarship, I always agree with all his conclusions, but for like the type of scholarship that I do, right, the kind of institutions and actors that I look at, he's huge, right? He does really great research, and he doesn't pull punches, which is what I also really love about his scholarship, right? He makes, really, I think, bold claims and can back it up with historical evidence, and he's, a really critical scholar. I will say that, like, oh gosh, what's the name of the edited collection? The American Colonial State in the Philippines was important, but most important about that was Julian Go. I went back to this essay recently. Julian Go's sort of introductory essay to that, in which he really lays out and just kind of gets the part about the U.S. operating on a global terrain of empires, right? For me, that's how I understood the U.S. empire. And, it's always, to be able to cite a senior scholar is really important. And so I returned to that essay. I think everybody who works on the colonial Philippines, at least, I guess, in my generation, hopefully going on, Paul Kramer's book Tome was really influential and important. And, he was an early interlocutor for me because he happened to be at Michigan when I was there, and was, always really supportive. But I want to actually throw out a few names of people who don't work on the Philippines that I think were also really sort of critical voices in my head as I was, figuring out really what I was wanted to argue. And so I always tell people who either work on decolonization, Cold War, Asia, to read Prasenjit Dwara's article. I think it's called Cold War as Historical Period, right? And so he really, urges us to sort of push the Cold War, not push the Cold War, sort of not the sort of take off the Cold War lens or whatever, but like think about imperial relationships in the intersection of in Cold War and decolonization. So that was an important article for me. I am really committed to reading, to remaining sort of as much up to date as I can on comparative colonial history. So mainly the British and French Empire, I would say. The Japanese Empire I've started to read a lot more about. Portuguese Empire, it's outside my realm. I can't do it. But Martin Thomas's book, Violence of the Colonial Order, really looks at this sort of interwar period in the crisis of empire. And his book was really important for me because he focuses again on the British and French and Southeast Asia. Maybe there's some Africa in that too. I can't remember. But everything that he's kind of describing, right, which is the sort of kind of colonial anxiety in this interwar period, as there's a really sharp rise in anti-colonial and anti-imperial politics after World War I, really mapped on actually to what the U.S. is doing, right? So, in the colonies in Southeast Asia, like one response to the sort of anti-colonial challenge is to sort of give more governing power to colonial elites, right? That's what happens in the Philippines as well. That's what happens in French Indochina, right? And so that really helped me to sort of situate the US as sort of part of this, again, these sort of global imperial powers. But what was particularly important about that book is the way he talks about violence, right? In thinking about interwar violence is not simply about anti-colonial, not simply about policing the politics of communism, right? Or anti-colonialism, it's certainly that. But there's just a sort of mundane management of labor, right? Maintaining the colonial order meant maintaining a kind of a colonial division of labor, right? And that being the sort of main source of violence during the interwar period. Yeah, I mean, my colleague, Monica Kim, well, she's not my current colleague, she's a grad school colleague, but I feel like we, sort of came up together trying to understand and analyze Cold War violence, right? It can be, I think it's hard, right? To sort of read about violence over and over again. And she was always a person who I could talk to about how to make sense of violence that can seem really senseless, right? Tons of new work, right, coming out on the Philippines, right? Simeon Mann's work was really influential. Moon's book was really important. Well, actually, the article that then became Moon's book was important. Yeah, I mean, your work, Alan, has been great. Tessa Winkleman, Genevieve Clutario's, like, I can't keep listing because like I'm going to forget somebody and then that will be bad. But yeah, these are people that I think have been really critical to working on the Philippines. And I didn't even mention like Ken Filler's work on the Communist Party in the Philippines, right? Historians, like, we need work that's kind of inspirational, right? That makes us think about the way we look at history in different ways, right? And that could be, right, a book about Egypt or something, and that could make me think different. But we also need the scholars who help us fill in context, right? To help us fill in the sort of histories that we can't do ourselves because we can't all do archival research, right? And so, that's why, Vina's book is super important. Ben's books is really important. Ken Fuller's work on communism is really important in terms of filling in, helping me sort of ground, my archival evidence, right, in the work that they've already done. I always want to give a shout out to my DIS advisor, Penny von Eschen, right? I mean, this is what I will, hopefully, like, I have thought about this as I potentially work with grad students too, which is like, Penny doesn't work on Asia at all, right? She's trained as an African Americanist, works on U.S. empire. If she has a sort of geographic focus, it would be sort of her first book certainly oriented towards Africa. And the next two books kind of more global. But Monica and I were her students at the same time. I was a couple of cohorts behind Monica. Like, she never wavered at the idea, or she was never insecure about the idea of me working on the Philippines or Monica working on Korea, even though that wasn't like her area specialty, right? And I think about that as, I see some colleagues who are like, oh, the Philippines, I can't do that, right? And I really appreciate that about Penny, because like what it did is like I was like learning from her, right? And I was learning from her not to pull my punches, to be bold, right? To look for what she would call like fissures, right? Or moments of sort of friction. But she was always like, tell me about the Philippines, right? Tell me what you see, and was able to sort of like connect this stuff that she was already, saw in other places in the world, right? And it really just kind of like, I think, expanded both of our visions, right, about U.S. empire, and let me be able to sort of make connections that were, not simply about the Philippines, right? It gave me a confidence, I think, to sort of connect the Philippines to other global events, right? And I think about that as I think about potential grad students, right? If I'm not a scholar of Korea, does that mean I can't work with somebody who wants to do a project on U.S. empire in Korea? I say no, right? I would want them to have somebody who could really dig into the Korean history part, but like I want to be as sort of open-minded to sort of the places that new students and their projects on U.S. empire take me as possible, and I really see that as part of what I learned from Penny, honestly. So definitely shout out to Penny Von Eschen. Work I'm eagerly anticipating. Oh yeah, there's so much, right? I just met at Schaefer, actually, Jeline Chua, I think that's how you pronounce her name, BU. She's looking at the sort of colonial period from the perspective of the Philippine Chinese, right? And she's kind of a legal scholar, right? And interested in the ways that sort of Philippine Chinese interacted with colonial laws to essentially kind of challenge anti-Chinese laws, right? I think this is super exciting, right? I think any work about the Philippine Chinese, right, is I think super, super welcome. There are, of course, good studies out there, but like I'm always like more and more. There's a grad student at Princeton, Jonathan Baldoza, who I had the privilege of reviewing an article that was actually just published in Labor, the Journal of Working Class History, who's working on sort of science and labor in the colonial Philippines. Really super excited about that. Juan Fernandez is a sort of new hire at University of Wisconsin. Super interesting stuff on ethnography and gender and actually indigeneity in the Philippines, which I think is actually a field that has a lot of room for growth. And well, Justin Diaz, who you've already interviewed. And then there's a scholar whose dissertation committee I sat on, a geographer, Mike Hawkins, he's a historical geographer, and he's working on a project about the Port of Manila from essentially the colonial period to the present. It's amazing. And then the last two people I actually want to shout out are two of my colleagues who don't work on the Philippines, but work on, I think, really, I think similar questions from different viewpoints on sort of U.S. empire in Asia. One of them is Patrick Chung, who's writing an amazing monograph about the U.S. military and the sort of growth of South Korean capitalism. It mainly takes place during sort of the Korean War, but also the second half of the book turns to South Korean involvement in Vietnam. And then the second colleague is Dokyo Choi, who's working on what I think is going to be a sort of remarkable and hopefully award-winning and groundbreaking book on Zainichi Koreans and post-war Japan, right? And for me, what was really interesting about his work is, not dissimilar from the Philippines, there's kind of like no history of Japanese decolonization, right? Because decolonization sort of happened overnight, right, at the kind of end of the war, right? And so he's, also kind of trying to write Japan back into the history of decolonization, and doing that by looking at the ways in which Japan had to kind of manage the 2 million colonial subjects, the Zainichi Koreans that were in Japan at the end of the war and were kind of made immediately stateless. So, excuse me, those are two scholars who I'm lucky enough to have as colleagues, but I want everybody to know about their work. This is going to be fantastic.